Good day. I am Hippocrates, and today I want to talk about Plato. And I want to formulate a couple ideas around Plato's concept of justice, virtue, his Platonic ideal, and how idealism gets applied to government, and how it affects Western people's health and their lives today. The first thing I want to discuss is justice. There's this whole big social justice movement of today, but what I really want to talk about is the original concept of justice and my interpretation of justice as it should be and as it ideally in my mind would be applied in today's society and going forward into tomorrow. According to Plato, what is just is something that is essentially a code of a system. It's motivated by virtues rather than fleeting human emotions. The old allegory goes, if you have two wolves and a sheep voting for what's for dinner, the sheep is for dinner. Mob rule is a thing. And democracy is not going to elicit justice. It's going to elicit the tyranny of the majority. So goes tyrannical rule of dictators coming out of large overarching paradigms. I hesitate to agree with the idea that a republic is the only way that justice can be obtained, with multiple equally standing vanguards. There can be a single vanguard family, that's entirely possible, and have an adequately just society with some minimal caste structure. Entirely possible. However, like Plato points out, that's going to require a philosopher class, a philosopher elite that really takes in consideration the society's interests, the plebeians' interests, first and foremost, and builds the society based off of that. As a medical mind, I want to also describe how justice is applied in medicine today, and expand that justice conversation into in the YouTube community. So in medicine, there are four bioethical principles, as they call them. There's autonomy, is will do no harm. Beneficence is we're trying to do the best for the patient. It's this individualistic, patient-oriented thing, which leads to its own problems, I believe, in society. Because if we're only concerned with the benefit for this individual patient, we see conflicts arise about what's beneficial for the community, which is something. It's something to be considered. If you're considering what's best for this tree, you may want to extract soil from surrounding trees because this is the tree that we're really interested in here, and then because this is the patient, this is the focus of my endeavors, and therefore these other trees, they're going to have to fend for themselves, and they're someone else's problem, right? So that's one of the problems with the actual on-the-ground application of individualism. Is it better than communalism? That is to be determined. I think each one has their own pros and cons, and I think they both run a course as a mindset. So back onto justice. Justice means there are four aspects of it. There's distributive justice, which essentially is you have to, in medicine there's not enough resources. That's just how it is. You can always pour more and more and more into research and into development and into investment into this person? And what do you do with when you have a million people needing livers, but you only have 5,000 livers to give? What do you do about that? So distributive justice is allocation of the livers in a way that is, as it stands today, let me state, that regards all of the individuals on equal footing, regardless of specific things like race, gender, creed, sexual orientation. I guess that's gender, right? How about maybe even national origin, right? That's another one that they're not legally allowed to consider. But they do consider things like whether this person was an alcoholic, and if they have an increased chance of requiring another one. Was this self-imposed, right? Is a big question. Versus essentially, what are their chance of relapse with this? Does this person have metastatic cancer? So that's a question that's allowed in the medical paradigm of today. Another one that's allowed in the medical paradigm of today is how much are they getting? And so is this an 80-year-old, or is this a 10-year-old? Does this person have 60 years left of life expectancy after this, if this surgery is successful, or does this person have 2 years of life expectancy? Essentially a glimpse into distributive justice. I think transplants are a perfect example of that. Respect for persons' rights is rights-based justice. That's essentially complying with the law, right? That's my supposition on justice. I would love to hear how you think about that. The next concept I want to discuss is motivation and virtue, and how those two things are interlinked in what Plato calls virtuous motivation. So virtuous motivation is not just basal instincts. This is motivation that doesn't come from the limbic system as much as it comes from the cortex. It comes from the cognition, which is a higher order. And not everyone can do that. It's a very limited amount of folks who express virtuous motivation at any given time. Waxes and then wanes across a lifetime. So children, for instance, they are not motivated by ethics and principles. They're more motivated by hedonistic pleasures. They want candy, and they want mother's milk, and they want to go to the bathroom, and they want to play, and all of these things. And as they age, they become more virtuously oriented according to what they think to be right and wrong. And then as you get even older, you lose that resiliency and you devolve into more of a basal animal again, as we are all animals, I should say. So devolving into a basal animal is just the natural course of life, and I think we should rage against it. But that seems to be in the books for all of us. Nothing against old people, it just, how it goes. That's my interpretation of virtuous motivation. There's the question of why should someone be virtuously motivated, and why should someone act with justice? Why should someone orient themselves towards civil success, essentially? And I think someone should orient themselves towards civil success because if you don't, then you set a precedence. Right? If one person if one person doesn't clean up their dog's poop than the next person does. It's the broken window theory, you know? There's something of an accountance that's going on, and people are paying attention and taking tabulations all of the time. It is of the civilization's interest to maintain a state of order because it's just largely better to live in a civilization where at least the ceiling of opportunity for a eudaimonic life, a fulfilled life, is higher. The ceiling for that is higher. The opportunity to obtain that is greater in a civilization than it is in a barbaric state. Especially for our lovely sisters. You know, it's very difficult for the weak to have a fulfilled life in a barbaric state. It's only for the very strongest that a pleasureful existence can occur in a barbaric state. So, on the idea of idealism, Plato, he came up with this notion that Sparta it's this societal organism that is greater than just the individual. The way they live their entire lives, from cradle to grave, is centered around Sparta. What is good for Sparta? And he considered that to be an ideal. And he aspired to have that applied to Athens, which was his native city. He wanted the inhabitants of Athens to have the most fulfilled life as possible. And that's what he considered his ideal. Very utopianistic. And what he thought was going to get them there was having something he called a republic, which was essentially, you know, most of these people are slaves. Most of these people are intellectually incapable. As I stated, even the strong, right? They came from intellectually incapable. They only reside there for a brief period of time. So, you know, maybe this subset of the population had rigorous thinking capacities up until their 40s or 50s or whenever they died from infection, right? And then, but in today's world, we decline after our 60s or so. So into our 70s, even the strongest men and the most psychologically capable men and women, I suppose, should expect to require someone to assist them, a ruler, if you will, a guardian, as children should expect. So that's a very interesting concept because it gets this idea, it really questions this idea of autonomy over self. Who should have dominion over the population? Who should have dominion over the individual? All of these things are big question marks. And what Western civilization came to as a conclusion is landowners should have dominion, and they should form something of a res publica, a people's thing, where they concern themselves with what is good for their demos, their constituency, their public, their people. And that was pretty much how it had been up until this most recent century, where they started to not concern themselves with what is good for their people in the West. But many of the leaders of the West actually eschewed the interests of their people in favor of what is good for humanity. And they used their elected and appointed and employing positions to distort the traditional understanding of justice and representation into a global order, as George H.W. Bush famously pointed out. He described it as a new world order of sorts. That seems to be something on idealism. But also, idealism has led the way to other utopianistic notions, right? So The idea of heaven, that's the ideal. Communistic brotherhood is an ideal. Feministic equity is an ideal. Totalitarian dominion is an ideal for some. Right? All of these are forms of ideals, and though they shouldn't be placed on equal footing and brought together in a single breath, as I just did, they are interesting insofar as they can be singular orientation mechanisms for an individual, which in that regard they can have equal weight in a democracy, which is so profound. Alright, so that's my conception. I really would love to have a response from anyone. Stand strong, Europa.